Friends, our reading this morning is a poem by Mary Oliver called Ocean. I am in love with ocean, lifting her thousands of white hats in the chop of the storm, or lying smooth and blue, the loveliest bed in the world. In the personal life, there is always grief more than enough, a heart load for each of us on the dusty road. I suppose there's a reason for this, so I will be patient and acquiescent. But I will live nowhere except here, by ocean, trusting equally in all the blast and welcome of her sourless salt self. The other morning, at a beach not too far from here, I had the pleasure of watching our 8-month-old puppy, Ashby, take his very first swim. Now, Ashby's a city dog, so he hasn't spent a lot of time around water. So I'm not quite sure he knew what he was getting himself into. But when the dog he was playing with at the beach the other day bounded into the ocean after a ball, Ashby plunged right in with him. When he first came up for air, I could see the surprise and fear in his eyes. He was a little panicked. How strange it must have been for him suddenly not to feel the earth beneath his little paws. But sure enough, those paws eventually did what nature has long taught them to do. They started paddling furiously, and Ashby eventually found his stride, or his stroke, I guess. And there was this moment after he'd figured out how to handle the water when I felt as though I could see the panic and fear in his eyes disappear. And he just looked like a happy puppy again. And it was as if in that moment he understood that he could trust the water. That if he let it, it would hold him up. It would support him. And then he got out of the water and shook himself off. Funny thing is, it was in that moment that I realized that the sermon I was working on for this morning, because, preachers are always thinking ahead to the next Sunday's sermon, even when we're walking the dog, maybe most especially when we're walking the dog. It was in that moment that I realized that this sermon, a sermon ostensibly about what the sea has to teach us about the spiritual life, I realized that it was instead shaping up to be a sermon about trust. A sermon about whether or not we can trust that even as we navigate life's turbulent waters, that we too will be held, that we will be supported, buoyed up, and that even after we're gone, we will be thus held, thus embraced. It's not always easy to live with this sense of trust and well-being that I'm speaking of. This sense of being at home and safe and at ease in the world. It's not something to be taken for granted, is it? At one time or another, we have all found ourselves in over our heads in dangerous waters. And just like Ashby at first, seized up in panic and fear, so are we sometimes gripped by fear and anxiety. You can say, well, Ashby's just an animal, but so too are we, after all. And we share with our fellow members of the animal kingdom that fight or flight response that gets triggered when we face a threat. And while this biological adaptation can serve us well in times of crisis, sometimes our bodies and our brains get stuck in this fight-flight place. And then we find ourselves living in a constant state of dis-ease, anxiety, and fear. I wonder if collectively we aren't living through such a moment right now. Can we just step back for a moment and reflect on what we've been through as a people over the last several years? For 4 years, we were gaslit by a president whose administration threatened many of the people we love and many of the values we cherish. Then a once-in-a-century pandemic upended our lives, robbing us of precious time and, for many of us, precious loved ones. Civil rights that we once thought secure, like a woman's access to reproductive health care, can no longer be taken for granted. Our democracy is under siege from armed insurrectionists and anti-democratic politicians, and every day, it seems, the news offers a stark reminder of the catastrophic impact of climate change, as Linda shared earlier this morning. The lives that perhaps we once took for granted, the futures we once easily imagined, are increasingly uncertain. We're at risk. We could be forgiven if we sometimes felt these days like we were living in a threatening and hostile world. I don't think it's overstating the case to say that we as a society have lived through a kind of collective trauma over these last several years, a trauma that's taken a toll on our bodies, our minds, our spirits, our psyches. I don't know about you, but I sometimes find myself noticing what's going on inside of me and saying to myself, wow, where did that too quick anger come from? Wow, what's with that fear that keeps creeping up inside of me? Or that anxiety? I think a lot of it is related to what we've all been through these last few years. And then I look around and I notice the coarse way that we sometimes treat one another in our culture, the small aggressions, the large ones, the polarized nation, our pandemic isolation, the militias in their bunkers. It's like we're all hunkered down, stuck in that fight-flight part of our brain, that ancient reptilian part of our brain. This way of being, it's part of who we are as human beings. There's no denying it. But friends, it's not all of who we are. And it's not how we have to live. It's not how I want to live. So what would it take for us to collectively breathe again, to unclench, to breathe, to believe again, to trust that though we live in difficult times, there are still well springs of grace and love that can hold us up, that can help see us through. Back in May I led a small group of about 25 people on a 75-mile walking pilgrimage in the Scottish Highlands. On the second day of our journey, as I was walking through the forest, I came upon a woman from our group who was sobbing in the middle of the trail. As she cried, her husband stood beside her, gently embracing her. As I passed them on the path, the woman shared with me that she felt that for her, the simple act of walking every day for several hours was finally opening up a space for her to grieve the traumas of the last several years. Not to mention one or two of them that went a little further back for her. There are two things about this little encounter that have stuck with me and that I'd like to draw our attention to this morning. And the first has to do with our bodies. Now, you know, the body doesn't get a lot of attention in church. Our culture is still beholden to a kind of body-spirit split or dualism, right? But a lot of good thinking and science has shown that we carry our grief and fear and trauma and anger, not only in our hearts or spirits, but also in our bodies. Maybe primarily in our bodies. And that if we are good to our bodies, then we're good to our whole selves. In this story, it was the simple act of walking day after day that allowed this woman to kind of release, to grieve finally. But it could just as easily have been yoga or swimming or biking or meditative breathing or getting a good massage or other form of body therapy. When we treat our bodies well, it's not just our muscles that relax. It's our heart. It's our spirit. The other thing that struck me about this encounter was that the woman on the path was not walking alone. She was accompanied by another. In this case, it was her husband, but it could have been a friend or even a stranger on the journey. The point that I take from this is that we shouldn't be walking alone right now. Because when we are ready to release our grief, our fear, our anger, we need others with us to listen, or to be with us, or to hold us. In my mind, one of the greatest costs of the pandemic is how it has disrupted our habits of being with one another, of seeking out the support and the connection that we need. In times like these, we need one another more than ever. I want to close by sharing with you a little story that the Zen masters tell about the sea. Maybe you've heard it before. It's the story of two waves on the ocean who were the best of friends and who traveled the high seas together for a long time, enjoying the sights and whiling away the hours, delighting in the freedom of being waves on the ocean. Until one day something happened. Something changed. One day, the larger of these two waves spied something on the horizon. At first, it was barely noticeable. It was just a thin line. But as they drew closer, it became larger and soon filled the horizon. The big wave described to the smaller wave, who still couldn't see that far, what he saw. He said, "Oh, little wave, I see something ahead, something large and solid, and we're headed straight for it." As they drew closer still, the big wave's anxiety increased. "Little wave, I see something terrible ahead. It seems to me that as the other waves reach this distant object, they disappear. They're gone." And later, when they'd drawn still closer to the shore, the big wave said to his friend, "Oh, little wave, it's even worse than I feared. It seems that when the waves reach this object, not only do they disappear, but there's a violent collision and they're dashed against the rocks. A terrible fate awaits us. What shall we do?" By now, the smaller wave could see the shoreline and the fate that awaited them. But the little wave remained strangely calm. "Don't worry," he said to his friend. "Remember, we're not waves. We're the ocean." Now, there's a lot that could be said about this simple story, but I'll leave it at this. When we find ourselves in the grip of anxiety and fear, when it seems that all hope is lost, it's good to have a friend around. It's good to be reminded that there might be a path forward that we hadn't yet considered. And it's good to be reminded that we are larger than we thought we were. Larger than our fear. We're larger than our anxiety. It's good to be reminded that we can indeed trust that the sea will hold us, support us, bear us up. Maybe in the end, this is why we have brought our spirits to the sea. Maybe this is why we can sit for hours and watch the tide roll in. Perhaps there is something reassuring in the rhythm of the waves crashing against the shore and then resolving again into the sea. Something that reminds us that even when our long striving journey across the sea is over, that we will still be held. May it be so, and amen.